Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in places that could expose you to identity theft. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, their US-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined by Stephanie Baker, author of Punishing Putin, Inside the Global Economic War to Bring Down Russia. Stephanie is a senior writer at Bloomberg News and Bloomberg Business Week. Stephanie, welcome to The Politics Guys.
Thanks for having me.
I always love getting to do our book shows. And Stephanie, I'll be honest, this is one of my favorite ones I've read recently, in part because you just kind of have a really gripping narrative, but you move around in time a little bit, I think very effectively to try to really get at, I mean, the central piece of your book is this idea of we've had this huge amount of economic sanctions, the biggest potentially in history against Russia. How did we get there? And then how effective has it been? So what drove you to write this book, your debut work, as a matter of fact?
Right. So I got my start as a journalist in Eastern Europe and Russia in the 1990s. I spent a couple of years as a reporter in Moscow and traveling all around the country. But Russia kept drawing me back. So I went back periodically over the ensuing years to do stories, often interviews with so-called oligarchs. And when the sanctions started stepping up after 2014 and then in 2018, again, I started reporting on the sanctions against some of these big billionaire figures. So I'd also spent quite a bit of time in Ukraine reporting on Rudy Giuliani and Paul Manafort and their work there. So when the war started, I just thought, wow, this is the end of an era. And I was immediately starting to report on sanctions and these just dramatic stories about hundreds of billions of dollars being locked down all over the world. And I just thought, wow, this is unprecedented. And it took me some time to figure out how to tell the story because it was kind of unfolding so quickly. But I did finally realize this was the end of an era. We weren't going back. All the Western companies I had seen flood into Russia in the 90s started to flood back out again. And so there were, discussions and, executive suites about what to do. And I just thought, this is fascinating. And I really wanted to explore, can this work? Because obviously Russia is a nuclear power. No one wanted to go to war with a nuclear power. And so the response really shifted to the economic sphere. And I just thought it was a fascinating area to explore with really interesting stories.
Well, and that's one of the things that we talked about early on in the Politics Guys in the war's early days was the effectiveness or the non-effectiveness of economic sanctions. And that's a big area in political science. And it's obviously the primary aim of the book. And you talk about the billions of dollars. I mean, as you put it in the book, it's somewhere in the percentage of 13% of the economy, or 239 billion is pulled out of Russia in 2022. Another 7 billion in 23. Things that would not have been on the average person's mind, things like the major banks being connected to or specific oligarchs' assets, central bank reserves. Take us through some of what makes these kinds of economic sanctions so large and unique?
Right. So I think the reason why I thought this was unique was because Russia is the largest economy targeted by sanctions, particularly such a large sanctions coalition. You've got U.S., Europe, UK, Australia, Japan, countries representing roughly half of the world's GDP. And sanctions programs prior to this had been very limited, targeted against Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, not major players in the global financial system. So the cost of imposing sanctions on those regimes were relatively small. But when it came to Russia, we're on a completely new sphere. And so I just thought it was a really interesting experiment that was being carried out. Russia is, by some counts, the most sanctioned country in the world, almost 20,000 designations across that coalition. Of course, in some respects, it's not as sanctioned as some other economies because we have allowed certain carve-outs for certain Russian goods to flow because of the dependence of the world economy on Russian oil and gas and metals and the like. So I think that this was a really interesting example how they got agreement across so many countries to go after Russia and try to isolate the country economically. And can it work? And we can talk a little bit more about that. I think that the goals of the sanctions kind of evolved over time as it became clear that Russia was going to be able to withstand this huge onslaught of economic penalties meted out by the G7.
Let's talk a little bit about that, because one of the things that I thought you laid out really well was maybe an old story, but one that I don't know that everybody, especially listeners, might not have. And that was kind of the transition, the failure of Russia to transition democracy and a market economy. And you go back and you take a look at that era and give us kind of at least a thumbnail sketch of that failure with Yeltsin, and then the kind of the rise of Putin, which leads to perhaps the early goals of the economic sanctions on Russia. So let's start there and just say, I mean, it seems to me the way that you lay it out that perhaps early on when we were thinking about what was going on in Russia in the post-communist era, that Obama was a little bit optimistic, I might be the way to put it. And at least according to one of the quotes you have, and again, we're getting this from Putin, suggesting that he could kind of have his way with portions of Ukraine as long as there was kind of not crossing a red line. Walk us through that. You seem pretty cool of that era of our policy with Russia.
Right. So first of all, I do attempt to give readers a kind of romp through the 1990s and the rise of Putin.
Which is not easy.
No, it was very difficult because I knew I couldn't cover absolutely everything, but I needed to give readers who weren't familiar with that history an understanding of how we are where we are now, that you couldn't explain the current economic war, particularly against some of the oligarchs, without setting that up and explaining it. And I also wanted to explore the whole question of where we went wrong. Where did the West go wrong? And I, looking back as a reporter in the 1990s, I went and sort of dug through my attic and pulled out clips. And I was very young and naive at the time. So just reading through that material that I luckily saved just made me realize how economically traumatic that period was for many Russians, that the transition to capitalism was so painful. So many people, went months, if not years, without being paid. And I think you can't really explain the rise of Putin without understanding the 1990s. And I did kind of go back to that period. And one of the things I noted was that Russia really struggled economically during that period because of corruption and mismanagement, and I go into that and the way privatization was carried out. But it also really struggled because at that time, the price of oil globally was relatively low, and Russia is very dependent on oil revenues for its budget. And I think that kind of informed the current economic war. That getting at Russia's oil revenues is absolutely key to the health of the Russian economy. So, yeah, I think understanding how Putin came to power, how he dealt with the first wave oligarchs that got rich in the 1990s is really important. And then how he enriched a new crop of oligarchs that were beholden only to him by doling out state contracts or appointing certain figures to state-run companies. That it was incredibly important to understand the way Russia works, that just by sanctioning these oligarchs wasn't necessarily going to bring about regime change, because all these people were dependent on Putin for their fortunes and tied into his so-called mafia state. Going forward to 2014, I do think that the Obama administration was caught unprepared for Putin's annexation of Crimea and his stealth invasion of eastern Ukraine. And we're kind of left scrambling for a response. Obama was the president who wanted to end wars, not start them. So he was very reluctant to get into, a direct confrontation with Russia over Crimea. He didn't want to go further than Europe wanted to go. So that was a natural limit to, the response. And the sanctions that the Obama administration drew up after 2014 were these sort of targeted sanctions, and they were new. These were ideas that had never really been tried before. They were mostly targeted at preventing big Russian companies, banks, and other like oil companies from raising money in the West, from selling bonds or selling equity shares. And this was a way for them to kind of gum up the financial plumbing of the Russian economy in these big Russian companies without having huge consequences for economies in Europe and the United States, because I think Europe at that time was coming out of the debt crisis, and they were reluctant to take on any severe sanctions that would further harm the European economies. Remember, Europe was very dependent on Russian energy, in particular gas, but also oil, and the ties between the companies were very deep. And the U.S. economy was still somewhat fragile, but it was in keeping with Obama's vision that, he made this very famous comment at one point about Putin after the annexation of Crimea, calling Russia a regional power, which was a sort of a direct affront to Putin, who really was trying to build Russia up as a major, great power. So I think because the response in 2014 was so weak, I think it did embolden Putin to move more aggressively later. And the U.S. did roll out additional sanctions in 2018 under the Trump administration, under pressure from Congress. And that only, pushed Putin to prepare his sort of fortress Russia strategy. He was kind of anticipating that he might be facing greater sanctions down the line, and he was preparing the ground to defend Russia's economy against additional economic penalties from the West.
And that then moves us to another point where you note that the failures of the Afghanistan withdrawal as we move into the Biden administration might have then yet been another moment for Putin to feel stronger and more secure in his ability to act in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of indications in reporting that Putin was emboldened by the disastrous U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, and only reinforced his belief that if he did go into Ukraine, the West would not be able to respond and would be too divided to mount any kind of cohesive response. And the timing, I think, was pretty crucial. Of course, the global economies were coming out of the lockdowns because of the pandemic. Putin himself was very isolated, and because he was very paranoid about COVID. He had his circle of advisors, and the contact with them was somewhat limited. And I think he probably knew that striking in February 2022, just as economies were reopening and inflation was really high, was the most advantageous time to strike because of Russia's control of energy supplies to Europe.
Well, and that's an important point, because one of the things that you kind of rightfully point out in the book is Germany, for example, had been pulling back its nuclear. It had a relatively robust nuclear, but had moved more towards energy, well, in the hope of long-term cheap energy coming from Russia. And so in that sense, there might also have been a thought here that, Europe was too economically energy dependent in order to have a strong response. Similarly, as you had noted a second ago, to the way that it did not want Obama to go too far in the first confrontation.
Yeah, and if you go back and you look at what some European leaders were saying in the run-up to the invasion, as the U.S. was sharing intelligence about the troop buildup, they were saying that, there would not be a response that would touch Russian energy. So I do think that Putin was reading those comments and believing that there was no way that Europe would be strong enough or united enough to turn its back on Russian gas supplies in particular, or Russian oil supplies. It was very dependent. Europe, the EU, bought a lot of Russian oil. So I think he was counting on division, and to some degree, although there was unity in Europe on a lot of things, there was division on some crucial points, which we can get into. Everything from oil to seizing of Russia's central bank assets to other things that, the difficulty of the EU sanctions policy is that it requires unanimity. And we've seen at various points certain countries, namely Hungary, blocking and frustrating EU sanctions policy towards Russia because Hungary is very much aligned with Putin.
Yeah. Well, and early on, one of the things that was unique from your reporting, you talk about, the United States, the UK, they're sharing intelligence, and their kind of prediction is that Ukraine militarily is going to last days. And you quote insiders inside of Germany talking about how it would kind of be a ghastly but good thing if Russia could just overrun Ukraine quickly for a human cost. And so it seems, at least, especially on the European side from your reporting, that Europe did not anticipate the ability of Ukraine to have held out even days, let alone as long as it has.
No, that's true, and I did quote Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz saying that, according to some comments that Boris Johnson, the former UK Prime Minister, made to me. About saying, oh, well, maybe that would be the best possible outcome, quick and painful though it might be. But let's face it, U.S. intelligence got it wrong too, because although they correctly predicted the invasion, they were assuming that Ukraine would fall within days, which is why they made that offer of Zelensky to get him out, and he refused. So the U.S. intelligence was not accurate, and I think it's actually an enduring theme, and it comes up a bit later in the book, and certainly during my subsequent reporting. I don't think the U.S. had a great handle on Russia's military capabilities, and actually, the war in Ukraine has lifted the lid on Russia's military capabilities in a really astonishing way, both giving Western intelligence agencies a look inside of Russian weapon systems like they've never had before, and how they learned how dependent the Russian defense industry is on Western microelectronics and technology.
Well, and that kind of comes into some of your questions about the effectiveness of these. And so let's start talking about the economic sanctions on Russia, because on the one hand, the early thought from the insiders, and your narrative plays out, is to say maybe we can use this as a way to deter Russia or to get them to stop. But that quickly, or relatively quickly, shifts, because that doesn't seem to impact at all, or at least Russian policy. And so as a result, it seems more as a way to isolate Russia, and in that sense to try to maybe keep some of these restrictions to be, well, useful, because you have all these examples of ways that it has been circumvented.
Right. So before the full-scale invasion, there were all sorts of warnings to the Kremlin that the economic consequences would be severe. And there was a debate within the G7 about whether or not to maintain what Olaf Scholz called strategic ambiguity, just not really tell Russia what the plans were in terms of economic sanctions, versus other countries that wanted to hit Russia with sanctions to deter them from moving. Obviously, with sanctions, you can't tell your opponent what you're going to do, because they'll start shifting assets out, and that undermines, sanctions as an effective tool. But I think there was some, overly optimistic predictions early on after the full-scale invasion and these unprecedented sanctions were rolled out, including the immobilization of some $300 billion worth of Russia's central bank reserves. This thing had never been done before on this scale. The U.S. had frozen central bank assets of Iran and Venezuela, but the amounts were tiny in comparison. And then kicking all these banks, Russian banks, off of SWIFT, this Gmail messaging system for, the global financial system. A lot of people thought Russia would not be able to survive, these unprecedented measures. Well, it did, and it rebounded on the back of high oil prices, prices that were high for, because of the very war that Putin started. And I think perhaps people realized that this was not going to be as easy as they thought, and that I think the thinking quickly shifted to, well, these sanctions can be a really perhaps effective way of bleeding Russia of the resources to maintain the war and finance it. And I think you see that play out fairly quickly as the sanctions unfolded. I don't think they were prepared. And you do see, and I do detail in the book, kind of slow rollout of certain penalties. Even to this day, when the Treasury, in the past few months, the U.S. Treasury has announced sanctions, and I go through this, these horribly worded press releases to make sense of them. And I think, God, you're only doing this now? Like Russian defense enterprises that are only being sanctioned now? Why didn't you do this 2.5 years ago? So again, I think, a lot has been learned, but unfortunately the rollout has been too slow to have a real impact. That's not to say there hasn't been impactful. And, the sanctions have cost the Russian economy hundreds of billions of dollars, whichever way you cut it, whether it's, as you mentioned before, capital flight, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of capital flight, money being, pulled out of Russia because of people didn't want to get their money stuck there. The cost of paying more to do these sanctions workarounds to get Western semiconductors that the Russian defense industry needs to make its precision-guided weaponry, the shadow fleet of oil tankers that they had to assemble to transport oil. So all these things have cost Russia a lot, have fed into inflation, and I think it is putting real pressure on the economy now.
But it wasn't quite, I would say, as you were noting there, the intention, though, right? So the technology export controls that you talk about, there always seems to be, as part of the narrative, right? Here's what the West does, and then here's the Russian response. So, for example, their ability to have smuggling networks and alternative suppliers like Iran, as you go through in the book, or on the oil price caps, but then Russia is able to kind of maintain that global supply, or when you have the money fleeing Russia, that then does create new opportunities for Russian businessmen, even if it was cut off from Western support, or other countries like the UAE, becoming kind of havens both for specific Russians and for Russian wealth. And so it really feels like one element of this book is here's what the West did, and here are the ways that Russia's continued to move. So it harmed them, I'm hearing you say, but maybe you outline the ways in which it has not harmed it to the extent that it had been hoped. Maybe that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's hard to prove a counterfactual, but I do think that Russia would be in much better shape without the economic sanctions that have been put in place. And, it's impossible to prove, but perhaps Russia would have been able to move further and faster without all the economic constraints that the West imposed. Having said that, look, the thing that I've tried to dispel is this notion that you impose a sanction and you walk away and that's it. That actually what is unfolding is truly a war. It is an economic war. And like any war, it's a dynamic process. And with an economic war, a sanction or a trade restriction introduces a distortion into the economy and an immediate incentive to figure out a way around it. And so it's a constant process. You can't just put a sanction Band-Aid on something and walk away and leave it alone. That this requires constant vigilance because Russia has found workarounds and will find workarounds and is looking for allies to help it. And has found willing partners who have found this as a great opportunity to make money for themselves, whether that is China or some of the companies or banks operating in former Soviet states that are profiting off of these parallel imports of goods that have been banned from going into Russia but are being imported via, say, Kazakhstan or Georgia, whether that's luxury cars or iPhones or even, Western electronics. So this has created a lot of headaches for a Western coalition. Imposing all these sanctions requires an infrastructure and staffing and resources that I think perhaps many in Western capitals didn't quite realize. You do see them stepping up. I mean, the UK, for instance, which didn't have a sanctions regime, really stepped up and built one almost from scratch and has really invested in people, both to be looking at sanctions targeting as well as enforcement agencies that they've stood up from scratch. So, we are really in new territory, I think, because there are now institutions being created to deal with this. But I do think we need to not think that this is just an easy tool that you can just deploy once and then just hope it's going to work. It's a constant battle.
Well, and that brings us to an interesting larger point about your book. In political science and in the social sciences, there's been a lot of ink spilled, a lot of research covered effectiveness of sanctions and the consequences and the downstream issues from sanctions. And so I'm curious, from your point of view, having done this from kind of the reporter side, how effective do you think sanctions have been to this point? A minute ago, you were kind of saying it's hard to prove the factual. I totally get that. But, putting that aside, just looking at what has happened, how effective has it been now that we're taking into account this increased institutional structure to enforce them?
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in places that could expose you to identity theft. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, their US-based restoration specialists will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Blinds.com is kicking off the savings early with Black Friday mega deals all month long. A Blinds.com design expert can help you make the perfect selection on your schedule. We can even handle everything from measure to your whole home installed for just one low cost. With over 25 million windows covered, Blinds.com is the #1 online retailer of custom window coverings. Get up to 45% off site-wide and a free professional measure right now at Blinds.com. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Right. So I think the issue with sanctions is they do take time to build up pressure. It's not a quick fix. And particularly for an economy like Russia, where it has oil export revenues that it can rely on, it is quite difficult. I mean, let's just get into that briefly, the efforts to cap Russia's oil revenues, which I think is key. So the EU at first says, the Europeans say, we don't want to touch energy. And then the atrocities at Bucha, which come out in early April 2022, just shock European leaders. And they do an about face and they decide, no, we're going to impose an embargo on Russian oil. And not only that, we're going to ban Western European services for all Russian oil trade anywhere in the world. That had the Biden administration panicking because they thought, oh my God, this means a huge chunk of Russian oil is going to be taken out of global markets. That's going to cause oil prices to spike and gasoline prices in the U.S. to go up right before crucial midterm elections. And so they come up with this wonky, out-of-the-box policy to impose a price cap on Russian oil, denying Western services, crucially insurance for these big oil tankers from transporting Russian oil unless it's sold below $60 a barrel. So it actually works for a few months, and Russia's oil export revenues decline quite considerably. But then it builds this shadow fleet of oil tankers to transport oil outside of Western insurance and shipping services. And that has been absolutely crucial for Russia's ability to maintain the war. It's been earning, hundreds of billions of dollars off of oil exports. So it's the central challenge, I think, of sanctions, which is unless you want to really incur costs yourself, unless the U.S. wants to really swallow the costs of an all-out economic war, it's going to be really hard to win this unless you really take your gloves off and really hit them where it hurts. But if you do that, that is going to cause prices at home to go up. So that has been a self-limiting factor. I think with Russia, before the recent tensions between Israel and Iran, oil prices were coming down globally. And briefly, Russian oil was trading below the cap, $60 a barrel. Tensions in the Middle East have caused that to go up. Nonetheless, I think Russia is very vulnerable to a decline in oil prices. And you see these overall trends happening with softening demand in China and Saudi Arabia wanting to grab their market share back. And I thought that this allowed the U.S. and the U.K. and the EU to go after Russia's oil revenues more aggressively, blacklist more of these tankers, maybe even drop the oil price cap to a lower level. They have been more aggressive on sanctioning some of these tankers. There's been hesitation, I think, in some quarters because they think that will take oil off the market and cause prices to go up. But I think they really could be more effective if they really went after these ghost tankers, this shadow fleet, in a more aggressive way. It's an accident waiting to happen. These vessels don't have a real insurance standing behind them. They're moving through European waters where the risk of a spill is very high. So I do think it's really important. You do see them trying to step up that action. If you look at the Russian economy right now, it's facing a massive labor shortage, combined with high inflation and really high interest rates, 19%. So that is causing the Russian economy to slow down, and the predictions are that the economy will slow to like 1.2% next year. But crucially, Russia's Russia's facing labor shortages as well as inflation, which is partly caused by the sanctions, which is causing imports to cost more. The inflation is also being caused by Putin's record spending on the war, which has just flooded money into defense factories, as well as bonuses for soldiers, to sign up to fight in Ukraine. But you do see these pressures building, and in particular, the one example I like to point to is the U.S. threatened to impose sanctions on foreign financial institutions that trade with Russia's defense industrial complex. They did that and first warned about doing that in December, and then they widened that threat in June. And that has had a real impact, actually. Just the mere threat of doing that has caused a payments crisis in Russia. Chinese banks are delaying payments. The cost of borrowing Chinese yuan has shot up in Russia. And it's one of the factors behind, and you see this playing out now, Putin is preparing to host the BRICS summit, the summit of what was once an emerging market alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now it's expanded. He's hosting this BRICS summit of these countries in Russia in a few days, and his number one agenda is to come up with a payment system for all these countries to operate together, because it's been a real problem. Russia's been striking barter deals with certain countries. Like the latest one was Russia's going to barter mandarins from Pakistan for chickpeas. I mean, so in many ways, the Russian economy is stepping backwards in time. It's actually becoming more Soviet-like. It's almost becoming like a planned economy, partly because the defense industry, the state-run defense industry, is taking over so much of the Russian budget and the economy as a whole. But it's having a real problem with payments, which is something that, of course, we saw in the 1990s, as well as during the Soviet period. So make no mistake, the sanctions aren't as effective as they could be, but it's not like they're having no effect.
Well, so one of the things, and you noted it in your response, and you talk about it in the book, is it's not sanctions, if they are going to have an effect, are going to take a considerable amount of time. But you also note that politics interacts with this on the Democratic side. And one of the things that it just kind of hopped off the page for me, because I'm an Americanist, was you talk about Putin hoping for Donald Trump to return to office. And so I'm curious on that. Despite the amount of pain that he has had and had further, do you think that he has been willing to live with of that as a result of the fact that we're in a presidential election cycle, and at least according to the individuals you interview, seems to think that if he gets Trump, the war will be over in a day, means that Russia is going to get a victory. Right. What you think the implications here of a Trump presidency is on all of this?
So I do go into, for instance, what Trump did on sanctions against Russia during his first presidency. And he did roll out some tough sanctions on Russia but mostly that was under pressure from Congress. Congress passed this act called the Countering American Adversaries, CAATSA Act. And it required the administration to impose sanctions on Russia because of Russia's meddling in the 2016 election. And so he did roll out sanctions against 7 oligarchs then. And there were additional sanctions in response to Russia's use of a chemical weapon in the UK, actually, as part of a chemical weapons accord. I do think, though, a second Trump presidency would be very different. I think that Trump has said, a number of things that indicate he will not continue military and financial aid to Ukraine like the Biden administration has done. He has said he will end the war in a day. He'll get Putin and Zelensky together or talk to them each and and end the war. And the only way to end the war is to cede Ukrainian territory to Russia. And possibly, I would say, offer sanctions, at least limited sanctions relief to Russia as an inducement, because at this point, Putin doesn't look like he wants to stop fighting. I don't think his ultimate goal has changed. He wants to control all of Ukraine. He wants to ensure that Ukraine does not join NATO. And so even if there is some sort of uneasy truce that the Trump administration, if Trump wins again, is able to broker, I don't think it will last for long. And I think the only way it would work is if Ukraine was armed massively to withstand a further Russian onslaught. So it's a very uneasy situation for Ukrainians looking at a Trump administration. Having said that, the Biden administration has only given Ukraine enough not to lose. And I think the Ukrainians are also quite frustrated with the limitations of the Biden administration's policy. And it's been quite risk averse. As has been reported widely, Zelensky's been asking for permission to use long-range missiles to strike military targets inside Russia, and the Biden administration has been blocking that, I think out of concern that that could potentially spark a wider war if Russia then responds, for instance, by striking NATO military targets in Poland that are supplying Ukraine. I mean, that's the sort of nightmare scenario. But there's no way that Ukraine is going to really win this war or get in a position of strength to negotiate unless it is able to strike military targets. I was in Ukraine in June, and just the constant air alerts and Russian missile strikes, it's just, there are these reports you see where the planes are taking off from Russian airfields, and it's, they're not able to strike back. These are planes headed towards Ukraine. And Ukraine is being forced to fight this war with one hand tied behind its back.
Yeah, they can't strike where they're coming from.
Exactly.
So, and that's, I think, another, maybe not a main point of the book for sure, but that lurks here, which is this. Okay, so on the one hand, we have the Biden administration, which sets up, it seems to be, in your view, a pretty successful set of, or a pretty strong set of economic conditions, better than what we saw coming before, restrictions on Russia, but at the same time, not really very timid on the military front. How long do you think this timid military support for Ukraine, combined with these huge economic sanctions, can allow whatever this, whatever the status quo that we currently have, where Ukraine is still independent, but clearly, as you're noting, in the midst of a conflict, how long can this last, in your view, having been there, having studied these sanctions, but also, of course, the military side? What happens next?
Right. So I think Ukrainians are weary. They're tired of the war. It is exhausting. And, there's an incredible scene in central Kiev that in the Maidan Square, the Independence Square, there's an area where there's a flag planted for each Ukrainian soldier that died since the invasion. And it's just the sea of blue flags. It's so tragic and moving. So that, there is a real... there are real costs, and they're being talked about in Ukraine. I think if Kamala Harris wins, I think she will continue the Biden administration policy. But unless there's a change of, a massive step up in military aid and a massive enforcement action and expansion of the economic sanctions, which I think they could still go up further, particularly on the enforcement front, I think we're in for a long war. If we just continue with the current policy of just enough military support to keep the Ukrainians in the fight, but not enough for them to really change the game on the ground. And likewise, with a set of economic sanctions and export controls, trade restrictions that are really good on paper, but unless they're enforced properly, they're not really going to have an effect. And that is a real concern. A long war, will be very damaging, I think, for Ukraine's ability to come out the other side. I do think Ukraine has a promising future if it can get the kind of support it needs. It's a much more unified society than it was before the war. When I was there in the run up to the pandemic, even in before 2014. So I think the options for the way this ends are either an extended conflict where Ukraine is kept limping along, or Trump comes in and declares a ceasefire, but that only allows Putin to regroup and rearm.
Mm-hmm. So when I hear that, though, it seems like there is no response in which there is a Russian change of behavior. You see that as being, it's going to be what it is unless the West either ramps up economic sanctions or ideally would ramp that up with less military restrictions on Ukraine.
I don't see any real change happening in Russia. And that's, I think there's a foolhardy notion that, just as soon as Putin's out of power, it will all change. Mm-hmm. And I think that discounts the degree to which Russian society has changed and how much support there really is for the war in Russia. Now, I don't really count Russian polling very highly, because how do you poll in a totalitarian regime? I don't believe any Russian would want to say what they really think. And look, it's hard enough to do polling in the US. So, but you do look at some of the polling and you do see some declining and softening support for this special military operation, as Russia still likes to call it. And that, I think, is significant. But when you look at the polling, the one thing that is clear across the board is that, the Russians, when they're asked whether or not they would support the start of negotiations, if the condition for doing that is ceding territory that the Russians have already taken, the answer is no. And it reflects the sort of anecdotal reporting I did for the book, which is that even members of the Russian elite who were against the war at the beginning, because all their assets in the West and their comfortable luxury lifestyles in London and the south of France were taken away from them, even they don't think Russia can be seen to lose in Ukraine. So I do think we are in for a long war, whether or not Putin is there or not. And look, it's a fool's game to try to predict what's going to happen in the Kremlin. I mean, I think Putin could be there for a number of years. And if he goes, it could be just very sudden.
Well, Stephanie, I really appreciate that. And I appreciate you being on the show.
Thanks for having me. It was great.
I've been joined by Stephanie Baker, the author, and the book we've been talking about is Punishing Putin: Inside the Global Economics War to Bring Down Russia. You can purchase that book in our show notes. Thanks for listening to the show. And I want to remind you, if you're not already a supporter of the Politics Guys, I hope you'll consider becoming one. Without our supporters, we can't keep this podcast going and bringing wonderful interviews like this to you. And so when you become a supporter, all kinds of good things happen. And some of those good things happen directly to you. You get access to additional things when you're a supporter of the Politics Guys. That includes our very active Politics Guys Discord group. There's even Politics Guys gear, all kinds of things to find when you become a member. So to check it all out, head to patreon.com/politicsguys. Again, that's patreon.com/politicsguys. Now, if you'd like to support us on Venmo or at Politics Guys, you can also support the show through PayPal. All of those support links are in the show notes, as well as on the web at politicsguys.com/support.
Whether you're a supporter or not, we would love for you to share interviews like this with friends, family, and more. Sharing the books and their things help the authors as well. So, on whatever podcast app you use, please share this episode. If you've got a question or anything else you'd like to share with the Politics Guys, you can always reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. We're also on Facebook and on X. You'll find us in the show notes. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilmer Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back, as we always are, with a weekend episode. I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.